Welcome to Your Voice with Dr. Susan, a safe place to let your voice be heard, where personal stories are shared that break myths and assumptions. You will hear conversations that can motivate you in your own life to accomplish your dreams. On today's show, I will be speaking with Clive Stevens. Clive is a musician, world traveler, poet, and a published author. You will be learning about Clive's musical journey and what inspired his creativity. Hi, and welcome to Your Voice with Dr. Susan. I'm so excited to have on the show today Clive Stevens. Welcome, Clive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. And just to say a little bit about you, Clive is a musician, an author, a world traveler, and a spiritual leader. I am so excited to have you on the show today and really talk about all of these different aspects of your life. So thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay. So, Clive, can you just tell us a little bit about how you started out? I believe that you're from London.
No, I'm from Bristol.
Oh, from Bristol. Okay.
Yeah. Bristol is a port city 120 miles west of London, very near Wales. But that was where I was born and bred until I came to the United States. I came on the Queen Mary.
And how old were you then?
19.
19.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about your musical influences.
I fell in love with rhythm and blues and then rock and roll. And then I was into that for a while, but I moved very quickly into modern jazz. My first instrument was the drum. My father bought me a snare drum and a cymbal, but very quickly I realized I wasn't going to be a drummer, So a friend of mine at the local youth club, his name is Dave Littlejohn, he had a saxophone for sale. I bought it, I took up the saxophone when I was like 12, 13. I'm the same generation as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, so, they were heavily influenced, obviously, by, the Stones were influenced by the blues, John Lee Hooker and these kind of artists, but they all loved Chuck Berry. I loved Buddy Holly and the Crickets. I also loved Eddie Cochran, who died in a car crash in Bristol, actually, right outside of Bristol. And in fact, I recorded one of his songs called Summertime Blues. And then there's Fats Domino. I love Fats Domino, because they had these rock and roll films, and I went to the theater and I saw Fats Domino there from New Orleans playing his piano. And he had like 8 tenor saxophones all lined up in sharkskin suits, all moving to the beat. And I said, oh God, I want to be one of those.
And was that here in the States or was that back
It was in England.
And you said your dad bought you your first drum set.
Yes.
Was he a musician?
No.
Mom or anybody into music?
No. There was an orchestral leader in the family in Bristol, but I never met him. He came before me. My cousin Barbara, on my dad's side, her husband was a orchestra leader. He played the violin, and he played in London at the Edmundo Ross Club. Edmundo Ross was a very famous Latin American band leader in London at that time, and he was the other band. In fact, I went to London and they took me to the club, and they told me to behave because Princess Margaret was in the club. So, she was a real swinger, Princess Margaret. She was the swinger in the royal family.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
She was,
that's probably for another show.
That's another show.
Yeah, that's another show, right?
This
So tell me about, now I think that you produced several albums, you have several recordings, and your music has developed over your lifetime in terms of what you play and what you're passionate about.
Well,
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. I was living in San Francisco in the Summer of Love. I was there in Golden Gate Park when Timothy Leary said, tune in, turn on, and drop out. And Jimi Hendrix was there, and the Grateful Dead were there, and Janis Joplin and Big Brother, and all the big San Francisco bands were there, plus Allen Ginsberg. I was heavily into the Beat Poets, Michael McClure and that whole gang, heavily influenced by them. But anyway, what happened is my brother came over to the States. He played for a Clifton rugby team, which were from Bristol. And then he wanted to come and see me. And so he came out to San Francisco. And then he wanted to go back to England.
When was this around? This was
like late 67. I had a really nice apartment next door to the Jefferson Airplane, actually. He wanted to go back, and he wanted me to come with him and go live in London and work in London, which I did.
Was he also in the music business?
He became my manager once I got back to England. And what happened is I went to live in London. And, you know, I was doing studio work with several famous pop bands like Manfred Mann and Alan Price for the Animals and some Jamaican artists. But I formed my own band in '69. I got a recording contract and we went in the studio, we made a record, and the record label was CBS. They decided not to release it because they didn't know how to promote it. It's too avant-garde. So I got really upset. I broke the band up and I came to New York, recorded an album with some of my tracks. My brother was working as my manager then. I got signed by a company called Cam USA. It was a very famous pop producer, Jimmy Einer, and an Italian publisher from Rome. He said, I will sign you to a major record label within 6 months, which he did. He signed me to Capitol, the Beatles label.
That's a big label.
So it was a big deal because this was like, the contract was worth $75,000, which was 1973. Mm-hmm. And for instrumental music, that was huge, you know.
And how'd the album do?
Well, the first one did very well, actually. Most of my sales were heavily in Chicago, which is a big music town, you know, but I think I sold like 20 or 30,000, which was
That's fantastic.
Was
really
huge,
good.
you know, really for instrumental music.
Yeah.
I got a 5-star review in Downbeat magazine for the first album because I had some very famous musicians on there, and the second album got lost actually.
When you say it just
well, it was not promoted.
Yeah. Now I know that you brought some clips of your music. Is that from any of those albums that you're talking about now, or that's from a later one?
The two video clips that I bought are the most recent.
The most recent.
Yeah.
So why don't we go to that now and just get a sense of? So can you just set it up because we're going to take a look at that. So the first piece that we're going to see is which?
Well, in order would be it's called Natasha.
Mm-hmm. Natasha.
Which I wrote for the German actress Natasha Kinski. I misspelled her name, which is, you know, I can't believe I did that, but her name is Natasha.
Natasha?
Natasha Kinski. I wrote it, she's one of my favorite actresses. And she's a very kind of metaphysical kind of woman.
And we're going to see you performing this where with the clip?
It was shot in Miami.
Okay, great. So let's go to that clip right now and take a look. And so here we go. Clive, that was fantastic. That was really good.
A friend of mine, she came and she did an exotic dance, with me playing a saxophone. So there was a storyline there. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Now, I want to go back to something in terms of
Yeah.
your beginnings.
Yeah.
What brought you to the States? What made you come here? When you said when you were 19 you came over.
Well, I was always fascinated by American culture. I mean, I was into like Marlon Brando and James Dean. I loved James Dean. I was into that school of actors, the method actors. I was heavily into those. I was heavily into the beat poets, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac. I love Jack Kerouac. I read On the Road. That was it. And American music, R&B, rock and roll, and jazz. This is. I was just mad with this, and England is. It's a phenomenal country. There's no country quite like England. But at the same time, it can be quite stuffy and very traditional. So the other thing is that I realized that I wasn't going to live in my hometown. There's nowhere for me to go.
So when you came to the States, did you come directly to New York, or where was your first stop?
No, I went to a place called Rockford, Illinois, which is outside of Chicago. When I came on the Queen Mary, my father's older brother, Harry, was the CEO of the Cunard Line. So I was actually at the captain's table. It was great.
So when you got here to the States, what was your first job?
I got a job at the Spaceboat Factory, and my Uncle Walter drove me over the picket line to work. That was where I went to.
You crossed the picket line.
I crossed the picket line with my uncle in the Cadillac.
Now, would you have done that today? Like, would you cross the picket line
I
to
would
anything?
have think very carefully about it. Yes,
that. Right.
But I was only 19, you see. So
no, right, yeah.
I was in the States, so I was like wild, Yeah. They let me on one of those, those lifts, So well, I'd be driving the lift around, and all the guys were just like,
You didn't have a driver's license, right?
No.
You had a green card, but not a driver's license?
No. But they were like, they saw me with the lift. They said, "Oh my God, out of the way!" No, I said it wasn't that bad, but
you also, we heard a lot about your history with being a musician.
Yeah.
And then you also became an author, and
Yeah.
you've published a few books. How did you discover or really find an interest in writing and then go on to publish some books? Maybe you can talk about that.
I've been writing poetry for many years. I've written a lot of lyrics. So I decided after my mother passed away, which was 2009, when I came back, just to honor her, I decided I would go ahead and publish my first book, which was it's called Stardust Transmissions, Poems and Lyrics for the 21st Century. I translated some of the poems and lyrics into different languages. I have one in Swahili,
Interesting.
Sicilian, German, Italian, French, Hindi. And I also had the cyber art of a friend of mine from Los Angeles who unfortunately passed away, Gil Malay. He was an incredible musician and artist. Had his artwork in there as well. So it was an interesting book.
And your mom really inspired that work for you?
Yeah.
And I know you talk about that a little bit in this book.
My mom was a healer. Yeah, she had a clinic in Bristol. She did advanced body work, deep tissue massage, and essential oils. She was fantastic.
And I know that you're going to talk about this in terms of you have a very big spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And was that inspired by her as well?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that in terms of the spiritual side of Clive and your beliefs?
Well, the thing is that, a lot of people, they go through life doing the same thing. Like they may be gifted or talented, but they don't seem to gain any wisdom or have any kind of vision. But, in light of how things have developed on this planet, I realized that it's better to use whatever gifts I have as a writer, as a musician, to try to advance the human race, the level of consciousness of the human being and the planet.
For the people that do know you,
Yeah.
is there something that people would be surprised to know about you?
Well, I'm speaking my mind more and more because, as I mature, this is where the activism, I'm kind of a shy Englishman.
Shy?
Well, supposedly,
Inside. You still feel like a shy Englishman?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in other words, I hope, English people are taught not to let their emotions, that was the way the English were brought up, certain things you don't talk about, have to hold things inside. That's why I always love, the Latin and the Afro races, because they're able to bring out their emotions, they can laugh, and just, which is very healthy. But when you hold emotion inside, it can go against you. It can make you ill.
And do you do that through your music too, in terms of letting that out? Do you think that music has been a source of expression
Absolutely.
for you? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before we go, there's another clip that you have, and I want to make sure that we also see that.
Yeah.
So let's take a listen. Let's go to it. Wow, Clive, that was really wonderful. Very interesting. That was a very interesting sound. Thank you so much. This has been really my pleasure.
God bless.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching Your Voice with Dr. Susan. You can contact us at yourvoice@drsusan.nyc. Thank you. You had talked about that there's a resistance, in a sense, to the paradigm switch between looking at substance abuse either through the lens of criminality, I believe, or a medical issue for people.
Right, yeah.
And that there was the kind of the dichotomy between those two, and that either people had looked historically through one lens or the other, but that the shift to move away from that, you talked about, I believe, the need, if I'm getting that correctly, and kind of this resistance. So if you could start by talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, so for so long in our history, we've thought of drug use as being something that was immoral, something that bespeaks a lack of willpower, or just failed social adjustment. And the response to that has been one of medicalization, which says that no, this is a medical condition, the way you would treat a lot of diseases. It's not the person's fault. It's, you know, something that needs to be treated with medicine. And that has good reasons, in many cases true, but we should be very careful about the idea that in every case, people's problematic drug use is a medical issue. That doesn't make it a criminal issue either, that there's got to be a third way, is what I'm saying. That's the way a harm reduction approach would take it. That what we think and do about people's use of substances should be anything that maximizes their ability to take control of their lives and to be as productive and happy as possible. So for many people, that might be medical treatment. And by the way, by medical treatment, it could be for other conditions. A lot of people use drugs and substances for self-medication, severe depression, trauma, stress, and anxiety. Many things that, if we had an adequate system to treat those conditions, we would find that their problematic drug use would subside as a natural consequence of addressing those issues. So we need not medicalize in every case this thing called addiction, when for many people, you know, their drug use could be a symptom of something else, or something that doesn't really fall within a medical paradigm at all.
Now, one of the things you also mentioned during your presentation was the media's role in terms of the way that they portray and frame all of the problems. And I was just wondering if you could give a specific message, what would you want to see from the media?
I love the idea that I could give a message to the media and that they would, A, that it would reach them, and B, that they would all like heed it. I don't think that's the case. I think it's an industry, right? And I know it's one in which you work as well. So I don't want to paint a broad brush as that it's, you know, a terrible industry, but it's still an industry. What I would advise is its consumers to be very aware of the hype that, you know, journalists have to put into their stories. I mean, there's a reason why they say if it bleeds, it leads, right? So there's a certain way in which, unfortunately, a media story that is published is one that has to be sensationalist. And we have to be careful of that. And even with something like fentanyl, which is dangerous, which is troublesome, which does bother me. But I'm not convinced that our anxiety is going to ensure that we actually do the right thing about it, which should be a public health approach. You have cities, including this one, cities and states across the country, which are making moves to, you know, charge people with homicide if they sold, wittingly or not, a bag of fentanyl to someone who has a fatal overdose. That's not good public health at all. And it really reminds me of what we did with crack cocaine in the 80s and 90s. And now we're living to regret those decisions. So I hope we don't live to regret decisions we're making in the 21st century.
Your mom's a social worker, and your dad was an author and
he was an academic and a philosopher, theologian. Yeah.
And so I was wondering, in terms of the work that you're doing, your life's work, and in terms of your career, you're a historian and you're committed to exploring substance abuse, and what influence did their work have on the development of your interest and passion? That's
an interesting question. In a lot of ways, their influence has been more than I might have initially recognized. I've given it a lot more thought recently. For my father, who was a pastor in a church, Baptist church for 10 years, was a philosopher, and he was an ethical philosopher at that. So he always lived his life by a challenge to do good in the world. For my mother's a social worker, it was the same thing, but from a different perspective. Like, she worked in juvenile justice and juvenile corrections, like children who had in a lot of ways been thrown away. And she was a counselor, a psychological counselor in that institution.
The first take-home point is that we now understand that addiction is a disease of learning and memory. And the importance there is that the brain is already equipped with the machinery to learn how to enjoy a reward, a banana or a piece of chocolate cake or a new friend, a new relationship. Your brain delivers a chemical to different regions of your brain that says, yes, do that again, right? We know that all drugs of abuse are taking over that process and really kind of over-learning it so that the person wants to continue with that drug, and that's what creates that type of myopic focus, right? That concept of it being an overlearned process that's similar to other habits that we might develop that aren't necessarily destructive. That concept, I think, is important for us to understand, A, that it is something that is developed over time, right? You're not born with it. If you never see cocaine or see alcohol, it's never going to happen, right? So it's an acquired illness. But because it's learned, we can use other regions of the brain to help compensate and change the behavior. So yes, it's a disease, but the person who has that disease still has responsibility to learn different ways of adapting so that it's not causing the same consequences to them or their families.
For people who have a genetic predisposition, do you think that there is a difference in terms of, for some people, actually, some people are wired differently, whether it be from genetic relatedness, for somebody who had a substance abuse problem versus somebody who did not have an addiction? Can you speak a little bit to that?
And that's a lot of what my talk will focus on, is giving people kind of a biological handle on what does it mean to have a genetic predisposition to something like addiction, and to think of that as it's not much different than having a genetic predisposition to being good at tennis, or a genetic predisposition to being good at some other type of physical activity. If you never see a tennis ball, then it's never going to show, right? If you never see the yoga mat being flexible, genetically predisposed, it's never going to happen. It doesn't really matter. And the other part is being genetically predisposed to addiction could also mean that those same genes work in your favor for other things, right? It just means that when cocaine comes into the picture, whatever wiring you have didn't work for you in that context, right? So instead of thinking of the predisposition as this, the same way that we might think of a genetic predisposition to anemia or Huntington's disease, it's not quite the same. It's more similar to the way we might think of our physical attributes, right? This person's 7 feet tall. He's genetically predisposed to possibly having a career in the NBA. This person's 4 feet tall. Maybe she's genetically predisposed to being great at ballet, whatever. The idea is having the genes is not a curse. It just says that in this specific context, your brain didn't do the adaptive, healthy thing. Let's think about how to change that. And I think that's where there's hope, where you're not condemning the person, saying, look at this disease that you're genetically predisposed for, but saying, look, your brain has wiring that we can actually use to your benefit.
And for people that aren't familiar with the brain research and really don't realize that it's not just as easy as saying, I'm gonna not use anymore. And I think it's very empowering and validating, because so many people struggle with what am I doing wrong? And it makes them feel even worse about themselves, which, as we know, of course, is gonna lead to even needing to use it even more, that substance.
My background is in the basic science, just microscopes, and clinically I see patients who struggle with addictions to alcohol, drugs, sex addiction, and things of the sort. My task as a clinician is to really see how those two overlap, and my task as a scientist is to use what I see clinically to start asking questions that I can then take to the laboratory and say, can we model this with our rats or our rodents, who they do drugs, as it turns out. Yeah.
Thank you for watching Your Voice with Dr. Susan. You can contact us at yourvoice@drsusan.nyc. Thank you.